everyone. So fresh back from MWC26 last week, and lot to talk about. The original title for the webinar was going to be solely about AI. And yes, we're going to talk a lot about AI, but we're going to talk about some other topics as well that were featured very prominently at the event. So that's me, and my contact information is there. I'm the lead SME in the telecom practice at TBR. So real quick, we have some research coverage on a syndicated basis. We come out with reports on a quarterly, semi-annual, and annual basis, depending on the report. We cover a variety of market areas from a benchmarking perspective, market forecasts, market landscapes, and we also have vendor and operator research. Some of the areas we cover are edge computing, private networks, hyperscalers, 5G, 6G, and of course, AI. So for today's agenda, we're going to set the stage and talk about an overview of the event and some of the key themes. Then we're going to deep dive into sovereignty, AI, and trust. And then we're going to talk about some other interesting things that we heard about and finish it off with what to expect for the telecom industry. And of course, we'll have Q&A after that. If you have questions, as Haley mentioned, put them in the chat box and we'll take them all at the end of the webinar. So setting the stage for the event, I'm going to first go through some event metrics. And there were around 105,000 participants this year. It was a little lower than expected. As everybody knows, there were flight disruptions from events going on in the Middle East. And as some of the airports in that region are major hubs, there was a significant amount of people that couldn't make it to the event. So they got stranded, or the flights, they weren't able to leave their home country at all. So the number was expected to be much higher than that, but I think 105,000 is still a solid number if you look at historically how many people typically attend the event. There were over 200 countries represented, countries and territories, around 2,900 exhibitors, sponsors, and partners. That's a consistent level from prior years. And the mix of stakeholders, more than half were from sectors adjacent to the traditional mobile ecosystem. So non-telco, non-traditional vendor, 58% of the people were from other aspects of the broader ecosystem. So that's significant. And actually that percentage has been increasing. Last year, it was 56%. So there has been a trend upward showing diversification of who's attending this event from a global perspective. So relatively strong attendance despite the travel disruptions and ongoing challenges in the telecom market. This is actually a good sign because it points to the potential for this market to grow. Even though growth has been challenging, there are some growth areas that we're going to discuss today. And let's jump right into that. So some of the themes at the event this year, of course, AI was all over the place, and specifically agentic AI and AI RAN and physical AI. So those are the three flavors of AI that we saw the most of. AI RAN, we're going to talk a little bit about in upcoming slides, as well as agentic AI. On the physical AI side, it was early days for that. This is really about using AI for robotics. There were some very preliminary demos that were demonstrated, but we're still, I'd say we're still a few years away from what I would consider to be physical AI. So most of the focus was on agentic AI, and then a subset of that was on AI RAN. Governance was a major topic at the event, and really about data management, risk, compliance, privacy considerations, everything having to do with data and how that data is used, how AI is used, making sure that there's no bias in outputs, making sure that there are structures in place to protect against risk, to protect against liability, and related things. Governance has emerged as a top of mind consideration when companies are looking to do AI in their organizations. Resiliency was also a frequently talked about topic, and it's really about resiliency of infrastructure and supply chains and other critical inputs. So resiliency, think about it in terms of submarine cabling and having diversification of routes to mitigate potential cuts or the risk of a cut, some of which has happened in the last few years. We've seen this happen and the disruptions that it causes. So resiliency was definitely top of mind. Also from a disaster recovery perspective, from natural disasters, how do we ensure resiliency? Satellites featured prominently in those discussions, and how satellite connectivity can be leveraged to address some of these objectives. Sovereignty was a major topic as well. And sovereignty, we're going to talk more about in upcoming slides, but essentially it's about building structures that protect or hedge a sovereign nation's risks and protects national security. We'll come back to that one. Trust we'll also come back to. Basically, who do you trust in the digital ecosystem? And can trust be something that is monetizable? And we're going to talk and unpack that a little bit more in upcoming slides. Don't forget to download the free copy of the full report that this webinar is based off of. It just published yesterday. It's about 5 pages, and it's about our takeaways, our key takeaways from the whole event, with some more detail than we're showing in this webinar. So let's talk a bit more about sovereignty. So telcos can play a key role in sovereignty initiatives, and there is an opportunity here to drive revenue. And I'm going to give you guys some examples of this. So first, let's talk about macro impacts. Governments are taking action to mitigate risks to national security. And when we say national security, think about it in terms of supply chain, technological innovation, talent development, and talent retention. Those are just a few flavors of what we're talking about with respect to sovereignty. Really, it's about hedging risks and building structures that enable a country to have some level of self-sufficiency. The recent wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, plus trade and alliance uncertainty, has reinforced this trend and made it a top-of-mind subject of discussion for the event. We now see more than 90 countries globally have formal sovereignty statements, suggesting this is a sustained policy trend. We are expecting some governments to spend big on sovereignty initiatives, and specifically Canada, Europe, developed Middle East, and parts of Asia and Oceania. So those are the areas where we expect governments to spend the most money and have the most robust structures in place from a sovereignty perspective. And really what they're trying to do, these countries, is they're trying to diversify away from reliance on the US and China. If you boil it all down, that's essentially what they're trying to do. And this is a hedging effort, and it's to protect national interests is really what this is about. A reassessment of those things, a reassessment of alliances and dependencies and interdependencies for national risk mitigation. So what is sovereignty? I've heard a bunch of different definitions as to what sovereignty actually is. The best definition I've heard is it's control with confidence, maintaining control of infrastructure and data with a governance framework inside national borders. So of all the definitions I've heard of sovereignty, this one so far seems to be the most encapsulating of what the way that we're thinking about sovereignty. And if I boil down how everybody thinks about it, this would be probably the best definition I've heard so far. So this is an opportunity for telcos, and I want to unpack a little bit about how and why. So telcos are at a critical position in national markets where they bridge between society and the institutional structures and business structures in a particular economy, both domestically and internationally, in interfacing with those entities. And they're also a conduit for conveying technological innovation to the broader society. So the telcos actually have a role to play here, and we are seeing some situations where governments are relying on telcos to do some aspects of sovereignty. If you look at France, for example, I mean, we see this already with Orange and the French government. So that would be one example where you have the government is working with a domestic telco to advance sovereignty objectives. Now, one area where telcos can participate is in the ownership and operation of data centers. Now, we know that the hyperscalers have a outsized presence in that today. That might change. It might look different 5 or more years from now if we start to see diversification away from certain non-domestic players and an emphasis on having domestic ownership of data centers and, of course, the data that is inside of those data centers. It's really about the data. PII data, national security related data, enterprise critical data. Where does that data go? Who's got access to it? How is it being utilized? These are key questions. And given the recent situations that have developed in the global economy, people are asking questions. And when they get answers to some of those questions, they might realize, hey, wait a minute, we need to rethink about this and we need to make changes. Telcos actually can play a key role in supporting government objectives in this area. So again, not just about owning and operating data centers, but also about the data residency and the management of that data. Could telcos be data management entities that are working on behalf of the government? They already do this kind of today, but doing it at a far greater scope than they've done historically. And there may be significant monetization opportunities for the telcos where the governments would pay them to support those objectives. We're also going to see situations where governments capitalize telcos to make strategic investments. It could be through cyber, it could be for redundant infrastructure. I talked before about diversification of backhaul routes. This is something that is top of mind. If you're reliant on one cable connecting islands to the mainland, that is a potential risk. And who's going to pay for that? It's probably going to be the government that's going to be the linchpin to drive forward these strategic investments. And the telcos and the vendors that support the telcos would be supporting those objectives. If we think more broadly about domestic ecosystem, it's not just about connectivity. It's also about cloud services. It's about AI, and it's about application alternatives. So as we know, the US and China have dominant positions in AI models, LLMs, in data pools, in the digital infrastructure layer. They have companies that respectively own and control platforms that are critical for digital societies. And is there a path for some countries or blocks of countries to hedge against that, to build some domestic infrastructure that can, be relied upon instead of non-domestic entities? Telcos could play a very important role in this. Now, what that might look like can vary, but the point I want to stress here is that governments are going to be spending more money, and telcos are well positioned to support at least some of the sovereignty objectives that governments are going to have. These are just a few examples of how to think about it, or how we're thinking about it currently. Okay, so now I want to talk about agentic AI. And what I saw at the event is that it's slow going for the telcos, pending governance, but AI for RAN has some initial traction. So let's unpack that a little bit more. So what we see right now from a commercial standpoint, what is actually being utilized at some level of scale in the telcos is traditional AI use cases where you're using structured data and things like pattern recognition, machine learning. That is being used at the telcos. And then some generative AI use cases, such as code development or content creation for maybe marketing materials or quotation generation for salespeople. So more on the sales, marketing, administrative, and IT functions is where we see generative AI coming into the telco. When we look at the network domain, it's very limited. And it's one of the reasons why it's limited is that is mission critical. The network cannot go down. And AI is not at a level of sophistication yet where it can provide that level of comfort in uptime in the network. And also, there's still hallucinations is an issue. But even beyond that, what about the data management and the governance? There needs to be a framework and some kind of a structure company-wide where people know what the rules of engagement are with AI. There's a data policy, there's a data management aspect that's embedded in the telco. There needs to be a breakdown of silos across the organization. There needs to be a breakdown of not only people silos where people are talking together, but also the data that those silos have today are working together. And that does not exist in the telcos today. Maybe in some small situations, but from an organization-wide standpoint, or even from the standpoint of the network domain, it doesn't exist today. So kind of need to get those structures in place to start really driving AI transformation in certain domains of the telco. So they need a centralized governance framework and a unified data strategy. So those are the buzz phrases. And it needs to be sponsored by the C-suite. This is extremely important. If a business unit is spearheading something, it may not go anywhere because the business unit at the end of the day is only responsible for that business unit. And it's hard to get the interdepartmental cooperation. There needs to be an overlayer with a consistent pan-organization policy in place for data management and the governance of that data and how AI is going to be leveraged at the organization. It has to come from the top. It's got to happen from the top. When we look at AI RAN, what I saw was a lot for AI for RAN. So AI for RAN is when you apply AI models to improve the performance, efficiency, and automation of radio networks. As we know, the AI RAN Alliance, there's 3 types of the RAN: AI for, on, and with RAN. So of those 3, it's the AI for RAN where we actually saw some traction. And we think that might be the flavor of AI RAN that actually gets commercialized first. What we're seeing is RAN vendors are putting optimized GPUs into the baseband in the 5G radios. And some of the use cases that we've seen is channel estimation, traffic prediction, and beamforming optimization. The initial focus of these use cases is on spectral efficiency and throughput boosting with lower power consumption. So when people say GPU, they immediately think power consumption, power hog. Well, those questions were asked at the event, and the consistent answer was, we've been working with NVIDIA to create optimized GPUs that are more tailored to baseband workloads. And because those chips are specifically engineered to do that, the power draw is significantly lower than what you see power draw in the training data centers where you're using GPUs to train LLM. So it's very different, and it comes down to the engineering, chip design, and also algorithm design. So POCs and trials, it looks like that's going to happen this year. And then next year will be commercialization, and then meaningful revenue. It looks like 2028 is going to be the year for that. So just before 6G, I think we're going to see some meaningful revenue from AI RAN in the market. Okay, and then lastly here, we're going to talk about trust. So trust is an interesting angle in that it could be an opportunity for telcos to compete against hyperscalers and OTTs. So let's unpack that. Almost $500 billion per year is lost globally due to scams and fraud. And this is eroding confidence in the digital ecosystem. In the emerging markets, especially, there's not that many protections in place. And there are devastating examples that were shared at the event and that get talked about in the news, where you get scams and fraud that cause people to lose their life savings or assets. Very precarious things that are happening through networks. These scams come through the networks, and it's really about how do we protect against these things and how do we minimize these things from happening. So the telcos sit as a critical choke point in the digital networks. They can be blamed for this, but they can also be viewed as a solution to this problem, especially if there's policy support and if there is some level of collaboration. So one thing that could justify more collaboration and attacking this issue of scams and fraud is if trust is viewed as a competitive differentiator, where telcos are marketing themselves as more trustworthy and safe for the subscribers that they have to partake in their services. And this is an interesting concept. This is being explored in India with Bharti Airtel, where they have some proactive scam mitigation infrastructure in place. Basically, they're using software and algorithms to detect and mitigate issues. And in some cases, they'd even go so far as to reimburse victims if the breach still occurs through the protections that have been put in place. So that's more of a nascent thing, but you can start to see a situation where maybe telcos can position themselves as, we will protect your digital footprint, and there may be some guarantee or liability management mechanism that is provided by the telco to give comfort to the people using their networks. Let's say that happened. We've seen collaboration on similar things. If you think about roaming, where the roaming issue was a big friction point for travelers, and that was solved through industry collaboration. So why not the security? Why can't the telcos work together on the fraud and scams? And they may be able to use this to their advantage, not only as a new cost item for them, but more of using it to potentially differentiate themselves from telcos that are not making, or non-telco entities like hyperscalers or OTTs that may not be putting those same protections in place. So it's an interesting concept. But the key question is, can this be monetized? Can trust be monetized? Would loyalty increase? Would telcos be able to increase market share? And would that trust lead to new opportunities? That's a key question. I think there is a path for that. I think that what Bharti is doing in India is compelling, and that could be a framework that other telcos could adopt as well. However, the telcos do have their own trust challenges that they need to overcome. And one thing is data breaches. There have been high-profile data breaches by very well-known telcos, even in the last few years, where millions or tens of millions of people's PII information leaked into the wrong hands. And also there's network outages, which is another form of trust. If there's outages and no explanation given to the outage, or these outages are impacting people's lives in a very significant way with no effort made to make things right with the customers. So for example, maybe they get a credit on their next bill because there was a major outage that caused dysfunction for the subscribers. The telcos really need to think about this because they need to address their own endemic challenges. And then they then need to shift the conversation to, okay, how do we take this and maybe do we use it to actually use it as a revenue driver? So some other interesting trends that we heard at the event is the evolution of the job market. So agentic AI job postings and AI agent marketplaces. This was an interesting concept. Basically, think of a hybrid between a hyperscaler's cloud marketplace and job platforms like Indeed. Think about a hybrid of those two platforms. And what you would get is something where people would source labor, quote unquote, from the agentic marketplace. And they're looking for specifically trained or experienced agents that are able to do certain tasks. And you pay whatever the payment terms are for that. That was less the talking point. The talking point was really, how is labor going to evolve? And these are pretty fundamental changes. I mean, if you look at the Anthropic AI agents that they came out with in the last month or two for legal, for content related tasks, for financial services related tasks, you can start to see this is a profound change in the market, how agents will be sourced, how they'll be trained, how they'll be accessible, and as time goes on, how they're actually going to be monetized. Another interesting thing that's nascent is photonics inside the servers, interconnecting with the GPUs inside of the servers. This is a big change because how servers are traditionally architected is they use electronic circuitry, copper lines inside of the server, interconnecting with the chipset. When photonics comes in, there is up to 100th of the power draw of a traditional GPU. So as we know, power is probably the biggest challenge to building AI data centers. And if this photonics trend is true, if this gets proven out, not only is this a big opportunity for early adopters from the server vendor market, but also this could dramatically reduce the cost of tokenization. It could open up new vectors for telcos to participate in tokenization at the edge and also building out the edge. So this is something to keep an eye on. This could be huge, the photonics trend. ISAC was another topic. It stands for Integrated Sensing and Communications. It's here now. We don't need to wait for 6G. There were a couple of vendors at the event that have ISAC solutions that are commercially available now. Governments already buy them. Some agencies are already using these ISAC solutions. So the idea that we need to wait for 6G, maybe not. Maybe we don't need to wait for 6G. Maybe 6G will help with the accuracy and the capabilities of what ISAC can do. But from a early use case perspective, where you can get some outcomes achieved, I think it's compelling, some of the technology that's available now. And then lastly here is quantum is gaining steam. So I did notice that quantum computing is advancing. Chip design is advancing. The engineering of the computers themselves is advancing. The algorithms that are used to train or to leverage quantum computing are advancing. And this may not take as long as people think to become commercially viable. We're going to start to see early adopters with quantum running useful applications probably before the end of this decade. just based on the speed with which things are advancing, especially when I compare what I saw from quantum for this year compared to last year. I did see significant improvement and innovation that's happened in just the past year. Okay, so what to expect for the telecom industry? So governments are going to spend more money. There's concern, uncertainty, and that drives behavior. And governments are going to spend. We're already seeing this, but we're going to see a lot more of it. And telcos will get some of these opportunities. We're already seeing this in places like France. We're expecting more investment in infrastructure for resiliency purposes. Governments are probably going to backstop some of that in some way. We may see telcos have opportunities to participate in the application layer, an area that they've been largely shut out from. If you have government support, if you have policy mechanisms that support, encourage, and incentivize the telcos to do things they may not have been doing before, that is a new opportunity. We may also see protectionism push more domestic opportunities to telcos. So we may see, for example, instead of buying services, ICT services for SMBs from a non-domestic provider, we may see situations where policy structures require domestic providers for those solutions. Here again, we may see situations where the telcos are getting business that they otherwise may not have gotten, or they're getting more market share in an area that they were not getting a lot from. And again, Europe, Canada, developed Middle East, parts of Asia and Oceania, that's what we're talking about here. Those are the specific areas of the world that we're talking about. Other countries may have ambitions to do these things, but they may not have the financial wherewithal. They may not have the talent pool. They may not have enough of the ingredients to do sovereignty where we would consider it to be sovereignty. So AI for RAN, it's promising further optimization of radio networks, expect efficiency gains, power consumption mitigation. And on the trust side, we're going to see more opportunities steered to telcos. AI and sovereignty require trust. So here again, we see trust coming up from a national agenda, not only at the micro level from a end customer perspective. And the reality is that if you look on a relative basis, telcos are more trusted than certain types of other companies. And this is legitimate. Like, people really do talk about this. And there is a perception in the market that is widely held, making that statement true. Okay, so with that, we're going to open it up for Q&A, and I see there's a bunch of questions in the queue. I'm going to go through as many as I can, and let's go through it here. So the first question is this only covering wireless or including broadband and internet? So the comments I made are covering mostly the wireless market, but there are absolutely tie-ins to the fixed networks and for broadband as well. So I was talking about route diversification for submarine cabling. That would be an example of the backbone network having investment. And then on the broadband side, government policy structures, as we know today, they're driving fiber to the premise initiatives. So you could expect to see more investment, policy support, funding coming into not just mobile, but also on the fixed side as well. So the next question is, do you see any national level sovereignty objectives and initiatives globally playing out in a similar way at the state level in the US? So yes, actually we do. But it's very early for that. So let me kind of So the states in the US, the states have their own jurisdictional oversight and their own strategic priorities, and they are competing against other states, right? They compete for tax dollars, they compete for talent, they compete for business, certain types of businesses. So if you think about states in that way, yes, there are things that are being considered that we've heard about where they may want to build some kind of structures to have, maybe sovereignty isn't the right word for it because they're part of the US, but building differentiators and competitive advantages relative to other states. I think that there is precedent for that. And also, if you look at states like California, where they have data residency requirements for the healthcare data of residents of the state of California, that would be an example where a state is acting in a sovereign type way because they want residency for their population inside the borders of their state. I would not be surprised if we saw other states do similar things versus you're looking at all the states as one patchwork and you can be data residency agnostic across any of the states. That's the stance most states take today. But we may see, for whatever reason, states start to behave in ways that we see California starting to behave in. So I think there is precedent for that. The next question is, for photonics, are you describing photonic chipsets? Yes, we're talking about photonics inside the server, not interconnecting the servers. I'm talking about in the server itself, where you have optics that are interconnecting with the chipsets inside of the server. That is the change. Photonics is not new, right? But it's coming into new domains that it wasn't previously in. That is the big change. And when you bring it inside of the server itself, you start to get significant energy savings. You get heat, much lower heat that you have to dissipate. So there's multiple benefits to using photonics inside of the servers that are running GPUs. And that was what was conveyed at the event.